After quite a few recommendations from a lot of you guys, I recently took the time to watch Studio Brainbase's Baccano. Or maybe Baccano? I'm not really sure on the pronunciation, but what I am sure of is that I had an absolute blast with it. For me, nearly every moment of this show just exuded fun and entertainment in its purest form. It wasn't a literary work of art, a complex symbolic piece, or a thought-provoking societal drama, but what Baccano was a stroke of genius when it came to maximizing enjoyment through its characterization and characters. I adored its vast cast of diverse people, and due to this, Baccano is able to execute an off-the-wall and eccentric plot that may have felt unnecessarily muddled if learning about and watching these characters wasn't such a blast. However, relating to this, I was kind of puzzled at something when reflecting on the show. After I had finished, I experienced an interesting thing. By the end, I was so attached to all of the characters, as much as I have been attached to characters in a while. My love for this cast was comparable to my love for the cast of something like Psycho-Pass, Ghost in the Shell, or Ping Pong. But those series spend much more time exploring the internal workings of its characters, so what puzzled me was the why. Why did I enjoy the cast of Baccano as much as I did? Eventually, I think I worked it out. The series is only 16 episodes if you include the OVAs, and has a huge cast that gets the limelight through 3 primary storylines set in different points of time, so it doesn't attempt to spend a great amount of time exploring the characters in depth. Don't get me wrong, these characters are explored and have plenty to them, like Claire and Jacuzzi, for example, but my point is that this depth is addressed without becoming a primary stylistic choice of the story's approach. And I think that this is a great decision. While I'm someone that loves learning about characters in anime, naturally or otherwise, too much serious focus on the internal workings of Baccano's characters would have taken away from what the series sets out to achieve. So the approach that the show uses with regards to its characters is all about efficiency. Baccano communicates the majority of characterization extremely quickly and outwardly using the behavior and dialogue of the characters. There are some notable exceptions, but rarely are we ever inside a character's head. This makes sense and contributes to the bombastic yet integrative nature of the show, achieved through all the wacky ideas and situations. But if a series takes this approach, then it can stumble into a pitfall, where the audience doesn't feel truly attached to the characters without an internal look. Luckily, Baccano instantly makes its memorable characters pop through the aforementioned efficiency, an integration of plot and character progression. Every character interaction has a point, and tells you a bit about the people and personalities involved, while driving the parallel plots forward. Sometimes in media, a problem can occur when stories unnecessarily take time away from the narrative to characterize, before allowing the plot progression to resume. Note here that I am talking about characterization, not exploration or development, because there is a significant difference there when it comes to this issue. But Baccano progresses its characters and plot on the fly without too many flashbacks apart from the parallel timelines, and it does this without feeling bloated, all the while moving smoothly through the story. And due to this, we get to know the characters like the back of our hand without the use of internal monologues or too much time spent on them. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only good way to approach characterization. It lends itself best to a more quickly paced show that doesn't have much of an emphasis on specific character philosophies, and I actually think that I prefer the more in-depth and meticulous character exploration of a series like Monster or Legend of the Galactic Heroes, for example, but this style fits the show like a glove. The appeal of the show's characters was also helped by the fact that this is among the most unique, quirky, and off-the-wall casts that you can find. Baccano is a story without a main character, one that holds a cast of at least 17 prominent people off the top of my head. Some of my favorite stories of all time have an ensemble cast, such as Fate Zero, Final Fantasy VI, or the lesser-known Suikoden 2. But this sort of approach can run the risk of lacking a distinct focal point throughout. However, Baccano can handle this hurdle with ease. There is so much life to these characters that the vast majority of them can shoulder a story sequence on their own. Not only this, but the variance in these characters was stunning. You've got sympathetic souls, morally backwards yet deliciously dark psychopaths, simple, good-hearted people, wandering characters without a purpose, a bunch of colorful mobsters, and Isaac and Miria, the absolute loves of my life. Characterization, diversity, and boldness in this show was second to none. Another asset to Baccano and its characters is its OP sequence, which, along with being stylish and accompanied by amazing music, achieves a better display of characterization in a minute and a half than I've seen in entire shows. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but whatever. With each character given a few seconds, this opening uses visual cues to display characterization incredibly well. Take the pair of Jacuzzi and Nice, for example. For their moments in the opening, we see the pair making a getaway from an explosion. Here we can observe many things in a tiny amount of time. First and foremost, we see that the two are holding hands, instantly establishing that they have a close relationship. Next, the OP lays the groundwork for characterization. Nice is very aloof and relaxed about the whole explosion situation, as indicated by her lack of urgency to get away, her little smile, and the fact that she's looking back at the explosion, almost admiring it, rather than facing forward and trying to get away. This establishes Nice as an adventurous and reckless type, while also communicating that this explosion was probably at least partly the duo's fault. If they had unintentionally become tangled in a violent situation, the two would likely both be actively trying to get away, but her relaxed demeanor disproves this, and indicates that the two are likely part of some criminal gang. Jacuzzi, on the other hand, is a picture of urgency, basically dragging Nice out of the scene. His anxious looks over his shoulder, the worry lines on his face, and the way he reaches his arm out at the end display that he contrasts Nice in that he's much more tense and worrisome, and perhaps has more of a moral compass. This also brings up the possibility that he is a reluctant participant in what jobs these two have been getting into. I don't think that I'm really reaching with any of these points. Most of these are readily apparent just through basic observation. And Baccano communicates this crazy amount of characterization in no longer than 6.5 seconds. And it achieves this level, or at least something close to it, for 16 of its primary characters in this OP. Now, I know that you may be thinking, yeah, Alec, this is all well and good, but it's easy to dissect this frame by frame. There's no way that someone could remember all of this information so quickly just by looking at some quick character clips. And you'd be right, somewhat. It simply isn't possible to pay attention and apply these things to memory so rapidly fast. I know that you don't consciously process all of this when you first see the characters in the OP, but I also know that our brains have a way of entering sensory information into our hippocampus in the background and without effort. Modern neuroscience and psychology has determined that through a mental mechanism called subconscious processing, our minds can store information that we may not have deliberately tried to learn. Have you ever had a dream where you were interacting with someone who told you about some sort of fact that you may have never heard before, only to wake up and wonder how the hell that foreign information was floating around in your head? Well, the answer to that puzzle is that you have heard it sometime recently, but you hadn't attended to it. That's subconscious processing. And it plays a role in Baccano's effective characterization with regards to its OP and character introductions. This factor subtly adds so much. Lots of anime tend to have a slow introduction to their main character or characters, gradually building up their characterization through exposition or internal monologues before the story properly starts. But in the beginning of Baccano, we're dropped right into the lives of these characters. There is very little exposition to establish them, and a very real sense that they had stories before we were introduced to them, rather than this introduction being jolting and ineffective. I've talked to quite a few people recently who agree with me when I say that any behaviors or actions that these characters showed during their first scenes felt natural, and the thinking while watching them was not, okay, I guess this is the type of character this guy is, but instead, yeah, this behavior seems to fit. There was a subconscious predisposed perception of some of these characters already. It was all incredibly natural and fluent, and to an extent there was already a level of investment in these characters. And that's because of the subconscious processing achieved through the opening sequence. In a story where characterization is essential, the great minds behind Baccano absolutely optimized their runtime to benefit their cause in a subtle but very big way. Of course, this isn't absolutely done flawlessly, and there are exceptions to the rule, but the impact of this is big enough that I thought I should bring attention to it. This OP is literally one of my favorite of all time, and it was formulated so that even before being introduced to the characters, your brain had already captured a subconscious, vague idea for what each character was like. Instead of being just pure eye candy, Baccano again demonstrates its efficiency through the way it displays its characters in the opening. And in a series that depends so much on its audience having a blast through the characters, establishing characterization like this is so important. But this anime is more than just a display of characterization. It's a story, and it contains all of the elements that make a story great. Baccano's tone is very unique and quite interesting to me. Throughout the entire thing, there was a distinct sense of lighthearted playfulness. Of course, there were some serious scenes and some sadness, but this variation is not so prevalent such that Baccano finds itself to be a show without a stylistic and tonal identity. There's a stark juxtaposition between some of the quite brutal violence that occurs throughout the show, and the lighthearted tone that this violence occurs within. But this refrains from being frustrating because the show has this darkly humorous tone consistent throughout, rather than constantly switching from light to dark. I found the musical score to be fitting and catchy most of the time, and the art and animation were more than good enough to support the story. In particular, I was very impressed by the color scheme that was used. The show was diverse and bold with its aesthetic and character designs, and managed to distinguish some of the more unique characters through this, but it also maintained a consistent theme, a slightly muted color palette to maintain an air of darkness that was very palpable throughout the story. The plot went all over the place and seemed like a load of beautiful nonsense, but it was actually very clear to see by the end that everything fit nicely into place, with some brilliant character moments sprinkled throughout. As I said earlier, the narrative was structured in quite an interesting way, using 3 different periods of time flowing in parallel, and alternating between these periods to communicate the plot. The first episode was basically a 24-minute flash forward, which sets out to confuse the hell out of you before the story gradually fills in the gaps and allows everything to fall into place by the end. It was an interesting approach, and actually quite cool to see how everything fit together and came full circle. But I'd be lying if I said that the plot and plot structure were my main draw of the show. What kept me intrigued and continually watching Baccano, so much so that I finished it in less than a day, was the anticipation of seeing these awesome and badass characters put through increasingly more insane situations and wondering how they'd react to them. And Isaac and Miria, because you can never have enough Isaac and Miria. I find it interesting that I liked Baccano as much as I did, because while I can enjoy any genre of anime, I definitely have a type, and Baccano definitely isn't it. It isn't really too dramatic, it isn't that complex or deep, it doesn't delve into character ideology too much, and it doesn't have a tremendously dark or tragic element that seem to be present in a lot of my favorites. But I found it a pleasure to watch regardless. The combination of a brilliant early 1930s setting, accompanied by an amazing dub to capture the atmosphere, the style, flair, crazy situations, delicious dark humor, memorable characters, and shameless fun, all made this one a joy to watch. I'd really like to thank everyone who recommended Baccano to me, and I give this series a glowing recommendation if you want to have a blast for 16 episodes. Thanks very much guys, and I'll see you in the next one.